So this is part two of family therapy. Most of the family therapy has focused on the systems theories and structural theories, but I just want to briefly mention that there are other approaches to family therapy. So we'll talk about classical approaches beyond systems and structural therapy, and then some newer approaches. So we'll start with the classical theoretical approaches to couples and family therapy. And these will sort of mirror the individual therapies that we've talked about. So we'll briefly talk about psychoanalytic theory, object relations theory. Then we'll talk about experiential approaches. And then I won't talk about this, but some family therapists do use other individual theoretical approaches like CBT, person centered, and so on. So these are classic because they're just, if we think back to individual therapy, these are some common individual therapy models that are now being applied to family therapy. So as you would imagine with psychoanalytic theories, it's the same thing but applied to families. So psychoanalysis really focuses on your early relationships with your parents. So the time from when you were 0 to 6 or 0 to 8. These are very important, and you'll learn things about relationships, about love, about care. And from a psychoanalytic perspective, you are going to bring those ideas, you're going to internalize those ideas and then bring them into your new relationships as an adult. So the people that you date, the friendships that you have, the marriages that you enter, will be carried, those ideas will be carried from your childhood. And so in psychoanalytic or object relations theory, family therapy, the goals are the same as they typically would be in psychoanalytic work, is that you're going to work through these unconscious conflicts. Could be things like the id coming out in family dynamics or the superego, um, and also work through transferences. So again, this is sort of this idea of significant people from your past you're transferring onto someone new. So maybe you're treating your spouse like um, the way you would treat your sibling, or you're treating your spouse like the way your parent treated you. So there are these transference um, relationships that can be analyzed as well. And again, you're going to have problems in your adulthood in your relationships if your childhood relational needs were unmet. So this is just to say that this psychodynamic perspective that includes psychoanalysis, object relations, can be applied to family therapy as well. The next slide will talk about experiential approaches. And this is most drawing from Gestalt. So Gestalt is focused on the here and now. And these experiential approaches also focus on the here and now. In these experiential approaches to family therapy, the idea is that you become stuck, um, and you're having trouble expressing your feelings. You become emotionally stuck and need to unstick. So basically, in this type of family therapy, they will help people become um, more in line with their real feelings and express them. So you can imagine with Gestalt type of approaches with family therapy, they might do a lot of these repetitions, trying to get people in touch with their bodies, in touch with their emotions again. Another thing that experiential approaches might focus on are acknowledging your own part in maintaining other people's undesirable behaviors. So this is sort of introspective a bit, getting people to think about how they're contributing to suffering. So this is a little bit even leaning into existential issues of taking ownership and responsibility of one's actions and how they might be impacting others. So beyond these more traditional approaches, newer theoretical approaches are being developed. And Just to note that these are being, I'm going to talk about them in the context of family therapy, but these theoretical approaches are also used in group therapy and individual therapy. So they're not just a part of family therapy, but I'm going to talk about them as newer family therapy approaches. So the first newer type of therapy is called narrative therapy. And as the name suggests, narrative, it's going to be focusing on how a family constructs its story. And so this is a postmodern approach where it's not just about objective reality and how what happened, XYZ happened, but it's how people think about X, Y, and Z, how people make sense of those things. So the idea is that reality is partly constructed in people's minds, and they tell a story to themselves, they tell a story to the family. And narrative therapists will get families to think about their story with a variety of different questions. So again, in this form of therapy, no reality exists beyond the stories we create to understand our lives. So one thing that they'll do is to externalize the problems, to separate the problem from the person. So rather than just saying you sound angry, they'll get them to think about anger externally, thinking about it like a another person in their life. So what is this character anger telling you? What does anger do when they come into your relationships? So sort of externalizing it, it might be personifying anger as like another person. It helps separate the problem from people and think about it differently. With narrative therapy, they'll also focus on small successes. Sometimes these are called unique outcomes or sparkling events. These little blips that most people might gloss over, but a narrative therapist will really dig in there and say, look at that, you did this differently this time. What did it take to do that change? This is a little sparkle in the world of dim and gray and darkness. Look at this small thing that you did, and really get them to focus on this and sort of start to change the narrative of their story. So rather than just being a victim of these external events that are happening to them, they become the courageous protagonists of their story. They're making changes, doing things in their lives that impact their outcome, the outcome for their family. And this can be really empowering to people. And it can be also really um, great for different cultures because you can be really sensitive to cultural issues when you're getting people to um, think about the story that they're creating, not the one that the therapist has, not the one that society has, but what is the story for this particular family culture? So this is narrative therapy, just a very brief one slide overview of it. It's gaining some traction. Again, it sometimes will have people write their stories out, but it's again focusing on their narrative and how they're thinking about their life and their family's lives. The final newer approach that we'll talk about is solution focused therapy. Again, this can be applied in individual settings, group settings, or family settings. So I'll talk about this in family settings, but this is also being applied in individual settings as well. So, solution focused therapy is a brief form of therapy. Sometimes they'll do it in 2 to 5 sessions. And they're really going to focus on change and solutions. They don't focus on the problem or the issues, but they're just saying, okay, all of these problems and issues, got to where you are, but we want to move you forward. So we're just going to focus on what we need to change, what solutions um, might be developed that we can just get you forward. Again, that they don't care so much about how you got there. And so they will do this by asking a lot of specific types of questions. The first is the miracle question. And let's say a family comes to therapy and there's an issue. Let's say it's an issue with the son is getting into drugs and alcohol in middle school or late middle school, early high school. The miracle question is a question of is okay, imagine that a miracle came and solved your issue, whatever it is, whether it's that, whether it's, let's say it's a family where the parents are fighting a lot, or there's a family where there was infidelity. The miracle question is going to ask them, imagine that a miracle came and solved your issue. How would you know that it's solved? What would be different? And they're really going to focus on this miracle happening. And then they're going to focus on how can we get your family to there. I mean, we don't have a way for a miracle to happen, but we know what you want. We know that this is your goal. It's going to look like X, Y, or Z. How would we know when it's there? What would be different? How can we work towards that? And I've used this in individual therapy, and it helps people get really goal oriented and action oriented, realizing that they have some power to develop their outcomes. The next question they might use is the exception question. So the question being, what happened when the problem wasn't an issue, when it wasn't happening? So let's say again, someone comes in and says, I've been fighting with my partner for the past 6 months, um, and it's gotten worse and worse. And then you might ask, when, when you weren't fighting, what was happening then? What was different? Um, why was it different then? And trying to get to the heart of the issue so that maybe you can build in some of those things again. Or maybe they'll ask, okay, during this past 6 months, I would imagine it's not all fighting all the time. When were there some exceptions to this? What was different then? How can we build in some of those exceptions so they're not just exceptions anymore, but more of the rule? Another example is um, if there's a child that's having temper tantrums in stores, you might ask, when did the child not have a temper tantrum? What was different then? And again, these exception questions focus on, okay, when our things are going right, we want more of that. How can we build those in? Then finally, we have scaling questions. So scaling questions invite clients to put their impressions, their observations, their behaviors on a scale from 0 to 10, with 0 being like really bad, there's no chance of this happening. 10 being pretty optimistic, there is a chance of this happening, things are going well. And you ask people um, where they're at and why they're not a little bit lower. And so let's say you say, okay, your family, 10 is the best you've ever been, 0 is a 1. Where are you at right now? And they might say, we're at like a 3. Okay, so you're not at a 2. What makes it better than a 2? And so you'll get them to focus on, okay, these things are still going okay. And then you'll focus on getting them to make these small improvements. Once they pick a number, let's say they said they're at a 3, and you would ask them as a therapist, what would it take for you to increase just by 1 point? You're going up to a 4. What would make it so that your family isn't functioning at a 3 level anymore, but at a 4? How can we make that small improvement? And so it's not trying to get them to be at a 10, that's unrealistic. So these scaling questions help put people in realistic spots. We just want to move you up slowly from a 3 to a 4 or 4 to a 5. So these are also um, techniques and strategies that solution focused therapists use. Again, this is just a brief overview of solution focused therapy. There's whole courses on this, but this is just a sort of um, provide an introduction to solution focused therapy. That ends our family therapy unit. I will be posting the Bowenian therapy as well on Blackboard. Please let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next week.